Hi BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. Carole Maso, Ava. The Ballad of Dingus Magee by David Markson. Meet Me at the Rascal by Harry Miller. This is the second book I was sent by the publishers Saggy Meniscus, hence this is not the final cover. When I come to talk about it, I will show the cover. Tim O'Brien, America Fantastica. Isabella Hammad, Enter Ghost. Some poetry, Victoria Chang, The Trees Witness Everything. And finally, Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends. I've already reviewed this at length, an hour-long video, so I'm not going to talk about it today, but it was in this batch of books that I read since my last video wrap-up. And I'll leave a link in the show notes to it, my review of it. Okay, so let's start with Ava by Carole Maso. So this is a book about a woman in her 90s, in her last day on earth, as she is dying. Now, you know, it's that sort of cliche of your life passes before your eyes as you die. Only this is supremely well done. It's lyrical, it's poetic, it's quite fractured, but it's not so fractured that it sort of it loses all meaning. On the contrary, it's very slowly layers and comes back to repeat things or move them on. And it's just so deliciously done. And this was published in 1993, and that's a similar time as David Markson started his what he called his notebook, his note card tetralogy, whereby it's sort of organised very much along the same lines as this. Now, this slightly predated the first of Markson's tetralogy, which is Reader's Block, but because Markson was literally sort of writing or arranging facts that he'd kept from all his reading over many, many years, I'm not going to say, you know, this inspired that or the other was inspired this. I'm just going to say that there's a similarity in that there's lots of sort of factoids here, because the woman was a professor of comparative literature. So there's lots of stuff about writers in here. Okay, so there are things like, you know, memories of great aunts and great uncles who didn't live through the Holocaust, of her sort of dating life. She was married 3 times and had other love affairs which took her all over the globe. So there's lots of writing about Italy and about France and about Prague and about America, of course. And in a way, the easiest thing I can do is just to read you one page to give you an idea. First of all, I'll show you what it looks like. So that's what it looks like on the page. As I say, these sort of chronologically different periods of time. You know, you may only get 1 line or 3 lines, then on to the next one. As I say, I'm just going to read and give you an idea. Danilo receives a new translation of ancient Sappho over the fax machine. I took my lyre and said, "Come now, my heavenly tortoiseshell, become a speaking instrument." The man to him had been a kind of mythic figure, an American adventurer, having made his millions in Alaska in a distant decade, having laughed heartily, charmed women, read with passion, played hard, fished, a sort of Ernest Hemingway, but kinder. He never thought he'd be the type to die. Did we not hold hands there, wiping away tears in the snow? There was sitting in the sitting room at the Algonquin. They were saying happy things to each other, praise. They thought they would live forever, their first meeting. What are you working on now? Danilo visits after the play. It was as if, he says, the leading actor had faxed in the performance. The amber letters on the screen, a computer virus, no known cure. Fax me harder. A red cross on a white truck. He had started the press because there were no books he wanted to read anymore. To City Lights he was repaying a debt. If we could live forever. I never thought I'd be the type to die young, he says. A billboard pictures Jesse Helms with the title Artificial Art Official. The billboard goes up, the billboard comes down, and who can figure what's what anymore? 3M, who own the space, having ordered its removal, saying it was in questionable taste. The child practices her alphabet. Now the billboard's back. The artist speaks. I guess the 3M national executives in their central office found an old crumpled copy of the Bill of Rights buried under the papers on their desk. The Bill of Rights, Danilo smiles, closing the paper. Where we might have gone together, he says, I can't go alone. And suddenly I'm closer to the end than to the beginning. So I hope that gives you an idea, because I feel that I've not really done this justice. This to me, this was so like the work of David Markson, who is my favourite author. But this was, this was different. This was lyrical, poetic, as Markson is in places. It uses sort of talking about real life artists and writers and stuff like Markson does, but there was something feminine about this, or female about this, as against what Markson did, and it's no less effective. And I just love this. 5 stars. And speaking of David Markson, this is his debut novel, The Ballad of Dingus Magee, written in the 60s or the 70s, or I should say published in the 60s or the 70s. Don't know, because this is obviously a reprint. And the first thing to say is it makes me sad, because I now have no more David Markson to read. And as I've said before, there are 2 very distinct David Marksons. There's a slightly more sort of commercial narrative form of his early books, which are very funny. Springer's Progress is absolutely hilarious. And then we get the more experimental stuff of the 90s, the note card tetralogy, as I was speaking when talking about this book. So this is a sort of an epic duel between a desperado and a rather hapless sheriff throughout the American Midwest before, wherever, I can't remember which state it was, but before it got statehood, and involves a cast of characters, such as a Madame Brothel who's kick-ass, an Indian score, this was written in the 70s, don't forget, published in the 70s, different times, a virgin believer of faith, Christianity, is looking for a husband. It's very bawdy, it's very over the top, it's very funny, but it's also quite smart. The desperado is far smarter than the sheriff, and even though he's captured twice and sentenced to hang, and they have to wait for the hangman to arrive, he escapes twice. But I think, apart from the sort of knockabout fun, I think it's actually deliberately lancing the myth of the Old West, the cowboy West. There are sort of tangential references that the desperado, knew Billy the Kid, knew Wild Bill Hickok, had bumped into Doc Holliday. And he's rather disparaging about all these characters. And the ending of this also shows that for all this sort of, this, as I say, this myth, actually they were quite small-scale, humdrum, flawed and failed characters. They weren't mythic at all. And I think that's Markson's purpose. Normally I'm not into sort of anything to do with cowboys and the myth of the West. It's not my country. It's not my mythology. And although I grew up watching cowboy films, I've long since tired of them. I would never go and watch a new cowboy movie, go and rewatch a classic cowboy movie. But this was good fun to read. This was sort of perfectly pitched. I gave it 4 stars. And on to Meet Me at the River by Harry Miller. As I said, this is the cover. And funnily enough, if this is about myths of the past, this is, I think, part of its mission is to sort of throw up myths of the near future. It's a future of a slightly skewed America, not exactly Trumpian, but certainly with elements of Trump, but also elements of sort of more progressive thought. And it's, having said that, it's sort of futuristic in that sense. Ironically, the family at the heart of this derives straight from the Borgias or Roman emperors, and all the sort of intrigue there. But it's not. It's an American family of property in Baltimore, in Maryland, and the original patriarch is actually the only kind and decent character within the whole book. It builds up this massive reputation for fair play and for helping people who need help, but his wife is very Machiavellian, and when he dies, she and 2 of her 7 children are locked in a sort of a war, although it's a war really between the brother and the sister, and it's over the top, it's violent, but it is cartoon violent in a way. The characters are cartoonish as well, but it's got lots of good lines in it, and I'll read a very quick sample in a minute to indicate that. But I want to talk about the structure of the book. You know, this is a book in the tradition of Aleppo, which means that it takes a restriction on what it can do in order to, for the author has to stay within these stipulations and still write the novel. So in this case, it took a 16th, 17th century sort of Chinese epic of, you know, a warring sort of governing family. But for every original line translated from the Chinese story, Miller has inserted 2 lines, and then in between those he's inserted 2 more lines, and then inserted 2 more lines. So I think there was 6 or 7 lines in between each original line of the Chinese. And in the author note in the back, he's quite interesting on this, because he says the biggest challenge is when you first insert the first 2 lines, that's fine. You have a smooth transition from the original Chinese line into your 2 lines, because there's a direct link, there's a direct feed. But when you insert 2 more and 2 more, it's much harder to keep that sort of smooth transition so that it flows from the first Chinese line through the next 2 that Miller did, then the next 2 and the next 2, because that's broken the link between the original Chinese and the first 2 lines that he supplied. But I have to say, he's done it really, really well. You know, it reads flawlessly. You know, seamless transition. You know, you unless you're really concentrating, it wouldn't really stick out which is from the original text and which isn't. So the fact that he's done that so well doesn't throw out the problem of this being rather cartoonish characters. I can only assume that actually is a restriction of not the Aleppo discipline that he set himself, but the original story of the Chinese tale of sort of trouble in the court, which he's transposed to a near future America. That has somehow lent itself to only having a cartoonish treatment. So I think it's really well done, and it's really well executed. It reads really well, but it is cartoonish. There's no getting away from that. All the characters are relentlessly horrible. There's lots of things whereby you go, well, there's no way they can come back into the bosom of their original allegiances, which is to the family, but they do. So it does stretch credulity in places, but again, I think that's down to the original text rather than, you know, what Miller subsequently has set himself. But just to give you an example of, you know, there's lots of good lines, lots of lines that land. There were plenty of hot tubs elsewhere that didn't come with morbid associations like strangling and flogging. When the partying crowd pronounced Mika uncool, his stock began to plummet in general. Tinus Jukman added grease to the fire by tweeting a satirical poem entitled For Mika. For Mika is a great gag. Although Tinus had never tried his hand at poetry before, For Mika came to be ranked among the finest verse of the late Republic. It was composed with the help of Google Elizabethan. The clever Dingus could even pun with the poem's title. Like cheap glittering plastic, thou knowest no shame, ran one of its lines, hence the For Mika. Your smile dost laminate, your presence contaminate, ran another. Now the ambassador's son drew the sort of stare he had no wish to draw. Baltimore, where everyone knew everyone, was a poor place to lay low. So there's lots of good gags. There's lots of good writing, but as a whole, I felt a little, I felt a little sort of, I guess, hungry after this read. It was a little light on the nourishment, but I gave it 3.5 stars. And funnily enough, Tim O'Brien's book, America Fantastica, shares certain elements with Meet Me at the Rascal. Now, Tim O'Brien is a very wonderful writer who writes very different books. So the three novels of his previous that I've read is The Things They Carried, which is a fantastic book on Vietnam. O'Brien, in case you don't know, served in Vietnam. But it's not just another Vietnam tale, because it deals in the term, it asks the questions about storytelling, the importance of story to preserve the memory of dead colleagues and friends. And then you had a book like In the Lake of the Woods, which is a brilliant piece of technical writing, but by technical don't get the idea that it's dry. It isn't at all. In the same way that, although this uses the Aleppo, it's not a dry exercise. You know, it reads better than that. And In the Lake of the Woods is a masterclass in writing, because there's a sort of thriller mystery disappearance at the heart of it, and it gives you 5 different possible outcomes as to what's happened to that missing person, and each of them is given absolute equal weight, that you come out of the novel not knowing which of it is. I mean, you have your own opinion, and the character work is superb. And then you get a book like Going After Cacciato, which is kind of like a Vietnam fever dream. So 3 very different books. And then you get this, you know, O'Brien is nearing the end of his life. I mean, I hope people won't feel insulted by me saying that. I saw a documentary on him, and, you know, he's not a well man. And this very much has the feel of his last novel. You know, it's quite chunky. But he's having fun. This book is an absolute, you know, joyride of light-hearted satire, which is why I say it sort of has much in common with this. And on the one, and as good as it is, and I gave it 4 stars. On the one hand, it shows how diverse and agile O'Brien is. He can write all these different types of books. But on the other hand, I can't help feeling it's so light-hearted and so light compared to the heavy sort of weight nature of some of his earlier books, that I feel it's slightly throwaway, slightly disposable, slightly takes the edge of the gloss off his reputation as a writer. I mean, I don't think it does, but it stands so much at the opposite pole, even as well done as it is. Okay, so what is it? So a man marches out of his job as the manager of J.C. Penney's, crosses the road and holds up a bank. There's only one employee in the bank, who's this woman. And he steals money out of it, out of the bank, which is actually less than he holds in the bank, in his own bank account. And then we go on this mad road trip, because he takes this woman hostage. And we get all these sort of mad characters on their trail. But the core of this book is this guy and his female hostage. He is you know, everything he does and says is a lie. He's a pathological liar. He's a fantasist. And part of his act of holding up this bank was to try and break out of the lie of his life. And inserted or interlarded between the sort of sections, O'Brien is presenting, you know, a post-Trumpian America where the whole country is infected by this disease of lying, of fake news, of not being able to tell the truth, of not being able to see the truth. And I'm not sure that his choice of main character in the man, who's a pathological liar, is weighty enough to underpin that as a serious idea. It's a very interesting idea, it's a very good idea, but I don't think it's best served by the sort of the shtick and the humour of this book, which slightly sort of works against the grain of that he's, you know, that it is in a way that he's warning of a sort of dystopian America, which, you know, can't tell truth from fiction. But the other character, the female character, is what really holds this together. She is born again Christian. She desperately wants to get married, but of course no sex before marriage. And she's trying to convert this guy. She thinks actually he's good marriage material. So that's why she sticks around as his hostage, sort of semi-voluntarily, you know, more than, say, Stockholm Syndrome. And it's there that, you know, the interplay between them is wonderful. I mean, she's a tremendous character. She's a real ball of energy and fury, and yet sort of this sort of Christian outlook on life, which she herself is forever sort of working to unpick in herself. So it's all good knockabout fun. It's very entertaining, but at its heart, it's a little bit lightweight, I feel. 4 stars. And on to Isabella Hammad's Enter Ghost. So this is the story of a British Palestinian who is an actress of reasonable, sort of success in the theatre, not Hollywood films, but in British theatre. And she's coming out of a relationship with a theatre director, which was quite exploitative. And in order to sort of put space between her and him, and also to have some mental space, she goes back to visit her sister in Palestine. And while in Palestine, her sister has a friend who is putting on a performance of Hamlet within Palestine. And the book analyses just how difficult that is. They're forever having to sort of cross through Israeli army checkpoints. They're forever under surveillance. Sometimes they can't get through to rehearsals because the roads are being closed off for security reasons. And not only is there a ghost in Hamlet, there's a ghost of the Israeli state. So, for example, during their first performance, a truck pulls up with 4 Israeli soldiers. So is the performance even going to go on? And most of this book is about the rehearsals and the difficulties they face, but it's not Hammad's fault that I come from a background of working in theatre as a playwright. So a lot of the sort of the sniping and the competitiveness between the cast and the director, between members of the cast themselves, I recognise. So in here, Hamlet is cast not with a Palestinian actor, but a Palestinian singer who's a huge celebrity, because the production figures, if we have this big name, it's going to draw lots of publicity and lots of people want to come and see it, etc., etc., etc. So one of the professional actors is very annoyed by this because, this guy can't act. And you get that all the time, even when you're not, between actors who are not, singers. So I do recognise a lot of it, but it doesn't, unfortunately, because I recognise it and to some extent and lived through it in my own productions, that stuff didn't get to me, didn't move me, I didn't find it interesting. What I found interesting, what I learnt a lot about, was the divisions within Palestine itself. So there are 3 different types of Palestinians, which I'd sort of never figured out before. One is those who hold Israeli passports, because they live in Israeli towns that are not part of the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, so they are technically Israeli citizens. And the director of the play, she has an Israeli passport. Then there are those who, from the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, who hold Palestinian passports. And then, of course, you have the British actress who's on a British passport. So, there's several times when they're driving to rehearsals in a car and they're going to be stopped at a checkpoint. And there's 3 different sort of identities and papers in the car. There's a British, there's a Palestinian, 2 Palestinian, and there's an Israeli. Then within that, there's those who are in Israeli towns, who haven't been sort of exiled to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. If they are in their original family homes, they sort of stuck out the Israeli sort of kicking them out and exiling them. But there are those who are in those Israeli towns who are not in their original homes, who did get kicked out. And both types are referred to as the 48, i.e. pre-Israel's independence in 1948. They lived in these towns, but some managed to keep their original dwellings and others didn't. So there are all these different divisions and refractions within the Palestinian community, which I learnt an awful lot, and I think that's what I most got out of this book. But I did feel that there were 2 registers within the book. One, when she was just talking about, the theatre crowd and, as I say, all these sort of competitive rivalries and stuff, was in one register. But when they were sort of broadened out into, the political situation in which they found themselves in and how that affected them as people as well as their work, I found that much more engaging. So I preferred that register. But the problem is that I felt that there was a split between the 2, that you were either in one or you were in the other, that they weren't blended enough for me. So that's why I gave it 4 stars. And finally, some poetry. The Trees Witness Everything by Victoria Chang, my second collection by Chang. I'll post the link to my first because that was a 5-star absolute read. This was something slightly different, in which she said, I'm going to read her note in the back because I think that sort of best gives you an idea. So these poems are also based on W.S. Merwin's poem titles as a way to subconsciously avoid preconceived subject matter in hindsight, and as a way to inhabit another person's mind. I selected Merwin's titles because of how open they seem. I selected a Merwin title as a prompt, then one syllabic form at a random from the above, and those forms are certain types of Japanese short poetry. So I wrote these poems in various Japanese syllabic forms called wakas, W-A-K-A-S, translated as Japanese poem. Specifically the court poetry of the 6th to the 14th centuries in Japan, such as, and then she lists the various different syllable patterns, but they're very short. That gives you an idea of the length. But they were really effective, I felt, in that they were asking the question, you know, a lot of them are about birds or other creatures in nature, and then she pulls it round in this very short space of time to an internal reflection on her life, or on other human beings. So I think it's very much probing the nature of when does the actual and the real, such as members of the animal species, become metaphorical, i.e. that we can then take back and relate to ourselves as human beings. And then when you add what she was talking about in terms of the title, that you read the title and it sets up certain expectations. How much of those expectations are met by the nature of the poetry that follows under the title? Because they're not directly drawn from each other. The titles are random and they are prompts, but there is an element of severance from what follows between. So there's an expectation of the reader as, this is going to involve that. And each time you ask yourself, is that linkage there? Is that association there? Is that sort of echo there? And sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But by doing that work, by forcing the reader to do that work, it imposes a level of really thinking hard about the poem and trying to get inside the poem to establish those relationships. I thought it was really, really effective. 4 stars. And that's it, apart from my review of Sally Rooney, which I will post the link to. So, what are we today? July the 11th. Tomorrow's July the 12th. And I start Mercia Cartarescu's Solenoid. A big book, a chunky book, I think a difficult book in all likelihood. It's a buddy read with Bob Black, one of my regular commenters on my channel. But that means that there won't be a plethora of videos because I shall be absorbed and consumed by that for however long it takes us to get through it. I do have one other video I've recorded, which is a sort of short discussion video, so that will hopefully bridge the gap until maybe a standalone review of the Cartarescu, or maybe I would have read some other books before. Anyway, we'll have to see how it goes. So, BookTube, thank you very much. Till next time.